In a fashionable area near her home in the centre of Paris, Madame Margaret Ascher is going for a stroll. A world away, on the other side of the Atlantic, her sister Irene Mausner is playing tennis on Long Island, New York. The fact that these two sisters are able to pursue such ordinary activities is not ordinary at all. In fact, it's a miracle. For Margaret and Irene are Jews who were born in Poland and were young children there when the Second World War broke out.
The ghetto, generally you could describe it as a little piece of hell on earth.
What happened to them and their parents is exceptional. There is only one other entire Jewish family known to have survived the Holocaust in Poland. Margaret and Irene's story has remained virtually unknown until now.
It was really a miracle.
It is a remarkable tale of sacrifice, heroism and courage in the face of ever-present death. Using interviews, archive and dramatic reconstruction, this is the extraordinary story of the family that defied Hitler. In September 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, Irene Friedman was 3 years old, her sister Margaret 9.
We lived in the best part of Warsaw, and we lived in a big apartment, 5 rooms. We had a maid and cook.
Well, there were 4 of us, basically, of the immediate family. My father, who was a lawyer, my mother, my sister and I. And we lived in a very good neighborhood where mostly there were not too many Jews who lived in that area.
On the 1st of September 1939, their tranquil world was shattered when the Germans invaded Poland. Their father, Roman Friedman, immediately joined the Polish army and left with his regiment.
Particularly, I remember my father standing in front of the mirror and putting on his uniform.
And then my father said, I have to join the division. So he left Warsaw, and they went to the Hungarian border, and he crossed the Hungarian border.
Once their father had crossed into Hungary, it proved impossible to get any information about him, and the girls and their mother lost all contact.
Nothing. Nothing. There was no news at all.
I assumed that he was dead. He was gone. He was gone from 39. I don't think he gave it a thought, really, anymore.
With their father gone and assumed missing or dead, the children were left on their own with their mother in Warsaw and at the mercy of the occupying Nazis. The Nazis began a vicious program of systematic repression against the Jews. Within a few months, Margaret, Irene and their mother Ludka Friedman found themselves ejected from their comfortable home.
One day we were going for a walk, and when we came back, the Germans threw my mother out.
And I remember them putting a watch on the table and told my mother that she had 5 minutes to get out.
Under harsh new laws, all Jews in Warsaw were corralled into a small and exclusively Jewish area. This became infamously known as the Warsaw Ghetto. Ludka Friedman and her daughters now had to move from their smart neighborhood to the extremely cramped and insanitary ghetto district. They rented a room in this street. Although their original home no longer exists, this part of the street still survives.
We were in a tiny, tiny room, my sister, my mother, and I. And there were all sorts of people in the same apartment, I think, and we just lived in this tiny room, and I slept with my mother on a kind of bed. I used to play under the table. My sister made me toys out of matchboxes. You know, it was very difficult at that time. As a young child, you just go along. I just went along with whatever.
The first step, what they did, is they called open ghetto. You could go out, but you couldn't live on the Polish side. So I still went to my school. Usually I walked, because the tramways were Jewish compartments, and I was afraid to get in there. So I walked.
But on November the 16th, 1940, the gates of the ghetto suddenly swung shut.
One day I went to go to school, and sorry, I couldn't get out anymore. Only few people who had laissez-passer, you see, and the others couldn't go out.
It was very frightening. If you walked in the street, you saw, little children lying and swelling because they had, nothing to eat. And I understand, I don't know, my sister, I think, explained to me, these were mostly people who came from Germany. And they had nowhere to go, and they just dumped them. I was walking with my mother, and she found some strawberries somewhere. And there were young boys that would flit by and tear it out of your hand. And I had a terrible shock when somebody, my mother's walking around with this little bag of something that was like diamonds, and this boy ran through, and my mother said, there's a Polish saying, na zdrowie, let him have it in health.
On the streets you had all dying people of hunger, and the Jewish children were dying of hunger.
At the time, 4,000 people a month were dying in the ghetto. More than 100,000 Jews were to die just from starvation and disease.
My mother was very hard. She said, you don't look on the left, you don't look on the right, you look in front of yourself, otherwise you will die. You will not survive.
For nearly 2 years, Ludger Friedman's strategy succeeded, and the three of them survived in the ghetto. But in mid-1942, the odds against further survival were to worsen dramatically. Starvation and disease made life in the Warsaw Ghetto perilous. But a sudden change in German policy in mid-1942 initiated something even worse: mass murder. The Germans began clearing the Jews out of the ghetto and deporting them. They told them they were being sent to work in the east. But in fact, most of them were sent secretly to their deaths in Treblinka, an extermination camp northeast of Warsaw. Ludka Friedman, on her own in the ghetto with her 2 daughters after her husband had disappeared, immediately realized they were in serious danger.
My mother got up and saw near the garden on the other side of the street a soldier with the gun. "Oh," she said, "it's something wrong. What's going on?" And we knew that it started deportation.
Various groups of the population of the ghetto would be called to what was called the Umschlagplatz, which was where, close to the railway sidings in the ghetto, where they would be grouped together. The selections would take place for those that were going for forced labour, and the others would be loaded onto trains, ultimately to go to Treblinka and to their deaths. And generally, each train would contain about 3,000 individuals. And during the large actions in the summer of 1942, a couple of trains might be leaving the ghetto per day.
This unremarkable Warsaw street was the Umschlagplatz, or transportation place. Approximately 300,000 Jews were rounded up here and sent to their deaths. Mostly in the Treblinka extermination camp.
People thought deportation was to go to work for the German places in the east of Poland. My mother, she said, no, 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 they are going to kill people there. So we had no future in the ghetto, you see, no future at all.
Believing that deportation meant certain death, Ludka Friedman was now desperate to try and save her children. She took a terrible and heartbreaking gamble to get Margaret and Irene smuggled out of the ghetto on their own. She somehow made contact with people on the outside. There seemed no way to smuggle the girls out together, so, young as they were, the only option was to split them up. Irene was to go first.
I remember the time when my mother arranged for some nurse to take me and pretended that I was her child. There was a German at the gate, and she somehow persuaded him to let her take me with her, because she said she couldn't leave me on my own. And I think that she was able to come in and out of the ghetto. I think she was a nurse, and they were so afraid of everybody getting typhoid and whatever it is.
Ludka didn't know if she would ever see her child again. Irene was taken to the Friedman's ex-chauffeur, a Polish Christian who risked everything to hide her.
One of the places I went to was our chauffeur, who was very devoted to my parents. He lived in one room and had his wife and his child, who was my age, in that room, and he didn't hesitate for a second to take me.
Irene now had a chance of survival. Saving Margaret was more difficult.
The biggest problem, it was me, because I had a bad face, meaning Jewish face, dark hair, a little bit curly hair, big nose with this. It was a problem. He made me go with the groups of Jewish people who work for Germans for nothing, just to go out for the day and be able to buy food. You were allowed to go there as you were 14 at least. I was 12, so she gave me heels. I walked with the heels, and I looked older than I was. And we went to the gardens of Germans to work for nothing. And it was organized with the niece of a friend of my mother and this woman. It was organized that there would be a bush, and she will be hiding in the bush, and I have to find her.
The woman took Margaret and hid her in an apartment whose occupants were away on holiday. 12 years old and alone, Margaret hid there in complete secrecy. She had no idea what was going to happen to her, or even whether anyone would ever come for her.
And I wasn't supposed to make any noise. And I was afraid that I would eat all her stuff, but I was so hungry. You know, I was sitting there 14 days on my own. Nobody came. It was terrible. I thought that I was alone, but it was a very big apartment. And there was another man hidden in another part of the apartment. I learned that after the war.
It was known in Warsaw that some Catholic nuns were prepared to hide Jewish children. Ludka secretly contacted an order called the Sisters of the Family of Mary. Their Mother Superior was prepared to risk death by saving Jewish children. Sister Antonietta, their modern archivist, keeps their records.
In 1942, the entire order adopted a policy of helping Jewish children. Because our sisters ran many orphanages in Poland, more than 40, they could find hiding places for the Jewish children.
Ludka arranged for the girls, who had been in hiding for weeks, to be collected and taken to the Mother Superior. But even then, the young girls were facing a life and death lottery.
But it wasn't said she would take us, the sister. They will decide, they will look at us.
We had a bit of a problem because Margaret, she sort of looked more Mediterranean, really. And most other convents they tried before, they wouldn't take us.
And a few minutes afterward, they look at us and our way of behavior and all this, and it was okay. And I slept in so clean sheets and everything. After the night spent in Warsaw, Sister Aniela took us to the station and take a little train to go to this convent, which was 12 kilometers outside Warsaw. It was very difficult, very difficult. I'll never forget in my life. Very scared. Because sometimes, you know, in the trains, the Germans came and they look at the papers of the Poles and took them to the work in Germany. The Poles suffered a lot. But anyway, you know, the Germans couldn't recognize the Jews. The Jews were recognized by the Poles. But it was terrible in this compartment. You know, when the conductor came, and you see, when you have a nun sitting between two children, none of the most anti-Semitic men or women in the compartment would go and call the German, because they knew that because of them, the sister would be killed. Never mind the kids, but the sister, they will never go to heaven.
The two girls eventually arrived safely at this Catholic orphanage in a village called Pude.
The largest number of Jewish children was hidden in the order's home in Pude, near Warsaw, where around 40 Jewish children were living amongst 160 to 200 Polish children.
These records show Margaret and Irene being taken in at Puede under the assumed names of Malgosia and Irina Mirsky. The girls were now in the relative safety of a convent. But their mother was trapped still in the Warsaw ghetto. They assumed their father was dead. In fact, unknown to them, he had survived and was in the Hungarian capital Budapest. His regiment had crossed into Hungary, an ally of Germany's, and been cut off there, unable to return. For the moment, he was being sheltered by contacts in Budapest. In the Polish convent, Irene and Margaret were trying to cope with being in hiding, as well as with the hardships of war.
It was very, very difficult because the circumstances in that convent were physically unbearably difficult. It was freezing cold, there was nothing to eat.
The problem of the convent was the food. They had no money at all. For lunch, soup, and in the evening, soup. But soup, water, nothing.
And they wouldn't allow me to go to school. There was a village school, and they took me there for a little while, and I think they were afraid that the children in the village would pick up that I wasn't one of the normal children. I was kind of different. So they made me stay in the convent by myself. I think I was like 4 or 5. And really, I remember, let's say, for 3 years, I used to sit in this room all by myself, and I had no toys, and I had nobody, and I had nothing, and I was terrified. Anyway, somebody risked their lives to bring me a doll. My mother's friend's daughter, who was Jewish but was working on the other side, and she came all this way out from Warsaw because to bring me a doll. So I had this doll, and then the doll got broken, and I never had another doll.
In sheltering Jewish children, the nuns of the family of Mary risked instant death by firing squad.
And that's why, all these people, they are heroes.
The Germans would, if they would find any Jews in the neighborhood, would walk them through and shoot them outside. So the children, I remember, would say, "Oh, look, the Jews are getting shot," and they were all like pointing and whatever. And I would kneel down and pray with all my heart, and my sister would pull me away. She said to me, "They'll think you're Jewish if you're praying for them." And of course, we were always having to hide on the attic, because if the Germans were coming to look for people, the nuns would alert us and we would go.
Frequently, the Nazis would raid the convent, looking for Jewish children, but despite the danger, the Mother Superior hid the girls and comforted them.
Me and Irene, they took us up the top of the house. And I was so afraid. She came to see me, and she said, my child, a house with the mother of constant help. Nothing can happen to you. She put the hands on my head, and I wasn't afraid anymore. She was so fantastic. Her gray eyes looked at you. She was so sure.
By the spring of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto was entering its final days. Less than 20% of the total Jewish population was still left alive. Suspicion grew about the deportations. Some Jews managed to stockpile arms, and in April 1943, they began to resist. Full-scale fighting broke out.
The ghetto uprising was a sort of a last desperate act by desperate people who, I think, knew that they were ultimately going to die. They were relatively well prepared, and when the German troops came in on, I think, 19th, 20th of April 1943, they had a fairly fierce battle against those troops. The entire ghetto, in effect, was destroyed. There would have been precious little left at the end of that uprising. The Germans called in every tool of their armoury, so they were dive bombing the ghetto area, there were flamethrowers, there were tanks involved, so there was precious little left at the end.
For Margaret and Irene's mother, Ludke Friedman, escape was her only hope of survival. After the German destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, the only building left standing was a Christian church. Out of a total population of more than 350,000 people at its height, barely 20,000 survived. Margaret and Irene's mother, Ludka Friedman, was one of them. At the last minute, just before the final cataclysm of its destruction, she had crossed from the ghetto into the Christian part of Warsaw. No one really knows how, but she probably borrowed somebody's permit. Passing herself off as a Catholic, she worked as an elderly lady's companion, but she lived in constant fear of being discovered and shot on sight. In Hungary, her husband's days of lying low in Budapest and of relative security had come to a sudden end.
Wo bolschewistische Panzerwege zeigen, nehmen deutsche und ungarische Flakbatterien sie unter Feuer.
In March 1944, the Germans occupied Hungary. Roman Friedman was quickly denounced and rounded up with other Jews to be sent to the death camp at Auschwitz. He was taken to Gestapo headquarters in Budapest, where events were to take an extraordinary twist. And to pose him with one of the most terrible challenges that could ever confront a human being.
He gets to the Gestapo and they take him to the main chief who had to take inquiries. And he looked around the room where he was taken and he saw a little chess play. And he asked the German, "Excuse me, sir, do you play chess?" And this guy says to him, "What do you care about this, you dirty Jewish dog?" And my father says, because my brother is a champion of chess, the champion of Poland, and I think champion of Europe once. And then he says, "Excuse me, sir." And my father said, I went high up. From the dirty dog, I became sir. And he says to him, "I am the best player of the town of Cologne." And I had the chance to be in a reserve, to play with your brother in a championship in 1932. Sit down, play with me one of the plays of your brother, and if you win, I will save your life.
So Roman Friedman now faced a game of chess which was literally a matter of life or death. He was only an amateur and not remotely in the same league as his brother. The cost of losing the game would be instant transportation to Auschwitz. It was the ultimate challenge. In the convent, Ludka's daughters heard the news that their mother had escaped the ghetto and was living undercover in a Christian district of Warsaw. But events soon placed her life in terrible new danger. On August 1st, 1944, the whole of Warsaw revolted against the Germans. This second uprising, called the Warsaw Uprising, resulted in 63 days of intense fighting and the deaths of 250,000 people in those 2 months alone. The Germans defeated the Poles and then systematically burnt Warsaw to the ground, block by block. Margaret and Irene had no idea what had happened to their mother and were traumatized by the very real likelihood that she had died in the fighting.
And I knew that my mother lived in a place called Jolibush. So I remember somebody saying, "Oh, Jolibush was burning," and, you know, standing outside and seeing the flames, and because it was close to Warsaw. And the depth of my prayer it was so profound that I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling.
By the time the Germans had finished burning the city, 85% of it was destroyed. Warsaw practically ceased to exist. Unknown to Margaret and Irene, their mother had miraculously survived once again. but only long enough to be rounded up with other Poles and sent to a concentration camp in Germany called Ravensbrück.
She was taken from the uprising as a Polish person, not as a Jew. And it was just a terrible, terrible concentration camp.
Ravensbrück, just north of Berlin, was mainly for female prisoners. Living in subhuman conditions, thousands were shot, strangled, gassed, buried alive, given lethal injections, or simply worked to death. It saw some of the worst atrocities of the war, including medical experiments on the inmates. In this camp, Ludka was put to work as a slave labourer in the fields. Hardly anyone survived for more than a few weeks. Back in Budapest, her husband was facing a game of chess, which was literally a matter of life or death. He and the Gestapo officer played one of his brother's set-piece games. Unknown to his family, alone and in a far-off place, Roman Friedman won the greatest gamble of his life and miraculously beat the officer. The result was better than he could ever have expected.
He won one of the games of his brother, and he was, they say in French, comme un coq en pâte, very well off in Gestapo.
At great personal risk, the Gestapo officer saved the Jewish prisoner from the gas chamber, and they began playing chess regularly.
And during the lunchtime, between 12 and 2, they played chess. And great friends till the end of the war.
Despite the danger to himself, a senior Nazi befriended and protected a Jew almost to the end of the conflict.
Not quite to end. He called him, he said to him, Roman, I can't do anything more for you. I am called to the East Front. We lost the war. The Russian troops will be here in 2 or 3 weeks. Escape, you hide for a few weeks, and you will see the end of the war. And we looked for this man, but we never found him. Probably he died in the East Front.
As the war entered its final stages, and despite the terrible odds against survival, all 4 of the Friedman family were alive. The dangers, though, were ever present. With Russian troops advancing into Poland, the Germans began retreating. As they went, they forced the civilian population to withdraw alongside them. At the convent, the nuns and Margaret were made to leave, but Irene was left behind.
Because I was very young and not capable of walking, I was ill at the time. I was always dysentery or whatever else we had. So I wasn't able to go. So my sister went without me. She had to go, otherwise they would have dragged her out or killed her or something.
But Margaret couldn't leave her sister behind. She was determined to escape her German escort and find a way to return and rescue Irene.
And we walked about for 1 hour, and then I saw a fence and a hole in the fence. And I stayed there till they went through. And I waited till the morning. And then I saw a German soldier and plenty of bread like this. I said to him, "Can I take some bread?" He said, "Yes." "And what are you doing here?" I said, "I am lost. I want to go back to the convent." He said, "Where are your parents?" I said, "My father is in Budapest and my mother in Warsaw." He let me go, and I tried to come back to the convent, but I didn't know the way. And I went through different places. At 2:00 in the afternoon, I saw the way to the convent. When I came back, I had bread. It was wet because I had fallen into some water, But I brought her this bread and I came back and she said to her friends, and you see, I told you my sister will come back.
When I think about it, I feel that really I owe her my life. And I was very lucky to have an older sister who took such good care of me. I really must never forget what she did for me. So, and she was a fantastic person, and she was absolutely phenomenal during the war.
At long last, in January 1945, the fighting ended. As Polish and Russian contingents liberated Warsaw, Margaret and Irene were able to re-establish contact with the nuns. As far as everyone was concerned, the two girls really were orphans now.
We thought that my father was dead in Budapest, and my mother didn't know anything.
Desperate for information, Margaret decided to walk to bombed-out Warsaw, a round trip of 25 kilometers.
A few days later, about 10 days after the Russians came to Warsaw, I decided to look for my mother. And then I started to go over this place called Żoliborz, where I knew that she was living.
There was nothing left, so Margaret went to the site of their original pre-war home, which was also largely destroyed.
I went to our house, which was burned inside, but the doorkeeper still was there, and I put there on the wall that I am survived in that convent.
Margaret left her simple message pinned to the wall of their destroyed family home, in the vague hope that someone might find it and bring them news of their parents. She then trudged all the way back to the convent.
We were just there. The war was over for us because we were liberated by the Polish contingent of the Russian army. And we were just there. I don't know, I don't think I went to school yet or anything, or did anything.
Some weeks later, Irene was unexpectedly called to the convent reception, where someone was asking for them.
One of the nuns mentioned to me that somebody came to see us, so, I looked at this gentleman, I didn't have a clue who he was. And they, so they wanted to get my sister, because my sister was much more with it. I wasn't at all with it. So I just went and ran up to my sister and I said, some man has come to see us. So she quickly ran to see. So my sister came, and of course it was my father. But I didn't know who he was.
I recognized him straight away. I was surprised to see my father. I was happy. And I said to him, we have to go to the chapel to thank the Santa Maria that we are alive. And he said, my daughter got crazy.
Chodźcie, zabieram was na ciasto.
He asked me, what do I want? I said to him, eat as much as I want, not to be hungry anymore. So he took me to the restaurant in Warsaw. And Irene, what did she do? She wanted to have special ribbons for her hair. And so he said he will bring her. And I went to this restaurant, and he said that he never saw anybody eating so much. I ate 14 plates.
Incredibly, the note Margaret had left at the family home had survived, and Roman Friedman, after making his way back to Warsaw, had found it, still pinned to the wall of their old home. But there was still no news of their mother. The family feared that she was almost certainly dead. After Roman Friedman's miraculous reunion with his children, he set about rebuilding his life. He based himself in the only hotel left standing in Warsaw, while the girls stayed on for the moment in the convent. They assumed their mother must be dead, but still had no information about what had happened to her. In Ravensbrück in Germany, where Ludka had been taken, tens of thousands had died. When the Russians liberated it on April the 30th, 1945, fewer than 4,000 people were still alive. Ludka was one of them.
The Russians came just in time. She was swelling from hunger. And probably another week or two, she would have been dead.
Ludka then worked her way back to Warsaw, still in her prison clothes. There she too found Margaret's message and went immediately to the convent.
She went on her knees to ask the Mother Superior whether they were alive. And the Mother Superior said, "Madam, you can get up. Your children are alive and your husband came back."
When Ludka arrived, the girls were praying in the chapel. She waited patiently until they were leaving.
Such joy. I mean, it's hard to explain, really. It's interesting, I had no emotion when my father came at all. But my mother was a different story. Well, I spent much more time with her, really. I mean, you know, during the war, somehow in the ghetto. And, you know, a mother's a mother.
It was fantastic, you know. Because we were very near my mother, because we were together. My father was away.
She just took us straight, did not another moment, to the hotel and presented herself to my father with her two children and said, "Here we are."
And started by a row with my father.
I never will forget that. I remember it was on a beautiful landing with a chandelier hanging still. I don't know where they got that one from in Polonia.
I said, "Ludka, what happened to you? You are fat."
And my mother was swollen from hunger because she hadn't eaten. You know, that was what happens. You know, when people don't eat, they swell before they die. And after that, I don't know, we must have stayed in the hotel for a while, and then they found a house outside Warsaw, and my mother and my sister and I stayed in that house.
Life consisted of eating.
All I remember that being fed from morning, noon, and night. I was so sick of food. You know, it was like constant food, because my mother wanted, you know, to get our health back.
And so, against all the odds, all four members of this unique Jewish family, father, mother, and two daughters, had survived the ghetto, imprisonment, concentration camps, and the constant threat of death to be reunited once more as a family.
It was really a miracle. Father, mother, and children.
The occupation of Poland generally was much, much worse than what was experienced in, for example, France or Norway or other points that fell under Nazi control. And most importantly, perhaps, the duration of that occupation was the entire length of the war. So for a nuclear family to survive that alone in Warsaw would be difficult enough. The fact that they're also Jewish and they also lived within the ghetto, I think it's quite astonishing.
My father was extremely generous, upright, ethical, and kind to everybody that surrounded. Extremely generous and extremely kind, and whoever worked for us never was always well disposed, and that's, you know, a key, really. We were extremely lucky. And I just feel that people should know that there were a lot of really wonderful people that helped. And you can't condemn the whole nation, because there were a lot of people who risked their lives and their family lives.
Despite the miracle of the entire family's survival, history and circumstance were to split them up again, almost immediately. After the war, and despite what the Nazis had done, there were renewed attacks by some Poles on the few remaining Jews. Astonishingly, the Friedmans now made another sacrifice and took another huge gamble. They decided to give their daughters up again and send them away. They persuaded a British rabbi to take the girls to England.
My father arranged for somebody to be our guardians out there, and we went to England in March 26, 1946. So we were exactly like 10 months at home, and we were shipped out with a bunch of Orthodox children and put in an Orthodox school, a good Orthodox school. I didn't see my mother really from the age of 12 to 18 because she wasn't able to come, and obviously we were not able to go. So our life was completely disrupted.
Despite being on their own and the huge gaps in their education, both girls put themselves through school and eventually university. Margaret went to France, married and helped run a successful travel agency. Irene qualified in dentistry at medical school in London. She too married. Their parents lived on in Poland till Roman died in 1964. He lies buried in this historic Jewish cemetery in Warsaw, within the former ghetto district, and forever close to where his wife and daughters survived the unimaginable. Almost nothing remains of the ghetto, but a dynamic modern city has risen around its ruins. After her husband's death in the 60s, the communist authorities finally gave Ludka permission to emigrate to Britain.
She left after he died. She survived barely 2 years in England. She had a coronary and she died at age 60. She had a very unhappy life. Totally sacrificial, really. But she was a wonderful woman. She was a wonderful person, great mother.
Ludka is buried in Golders Green Cemetery, North London. Her sacrifices were not in vain. Margaret, her older daughter, lived on in Paris. Today she's 77, a widow and retired, but with 2 daughters of her own and 4 grandchildren. On the other side of the Atlantic in New York, Ludka's younger daughter, Irene, has become a much sought-after specialist in dentistry and is still working at the age of 71. She lives in a fashionable Manhattan apartment and also has 2 children and 4 grandchildren. And so, despite the murderous odds that were dealt them, Ludka and Roman's line lives on.
I think it's a victory story.
I think it's luck. It's the intelligence of my mother and a little bit of money and a lot of thing that we had people who would give us a hand. And this is more than money.
You always have to fight not to be a victim. And if you can keep your head up, then you can accomplish a great deal, and you must never feel a victim.